Hello, hello everyone, and thank you for listening to the following monologue on the question of. I'm gonna take off my glasses, reduce the glare. On the question of should the U.S. government include a citizenship question in the upcoming decennial survey slash census that is conducted every 10 years. So the Trump administration has decided to do so, or has wanted to do so, and yet its quest to do so was struck down by the Supreme Court, 5-4 decision um, against it. And the reasoning of the Supreme Court is that the Trump administration has not justified its decision to include that question in the survey. So it argued that under the APA, Administrative Procedure Act, the government has to justify its actions. And the excuse, the ruse that Trump administration used that that the reason it's asking about the citizenship is to enforce the Voting Rights Act is just a ruse. That's not the real reason why it wants the citizenship question included in the census. And so the Supreme Court says that's not the real reason. You're bullshitting me. Therefore, you are prohibited from including it until you give me the real reason. So yes, it left open the possibility that it could be included, but it placed the onus on the Trump administration to provide the real reason. Okay, so I disagree with that decision. I'm actually disappointed that the Chief Justice, what's his name? I don't know, whatever, but he's supposedly a conservative, and he voted against. You know, a conservative should understand that the judiciary should rarely interfere in executive things unless it's obvious that the executive is not justified. In a case when it's a close call or it's not sure, then you should let it go. And in a case like this, first of all, this whole APA thing that a government has to justify its actions is I think extreme. Um, but additionally, um, this is it's self-justified. The government doesn't have to give a conscious decision for this. Okay, if it's a reasonable thing in any reasonable person's judgment for the government to include such a question, then it's self-evidently justified. Um, just a case in point, um, none of the questions in the census are specifically related to the core mission, the core purpose of the census as defined by law, which is to count the population of the country for the purpose of apportioning representatives in Congress. That is the one of the chief missions, one of the chief reasons for it. Um, uh, Another reason is to help states, give that information to states so the states could use that in whatever way they want. But but yeah, essentially, the core purpose of the census is simply to count the population. It's not to ask about your gender, about your race, about your age, how many people are in the household. I mean, obviously, you could ask that as part of the reason to, as part of the objective of determining the population, but not for the purposes of determining how many households there are, because that's not part of the, that's not part of the core mission. Anyway, my point is that the government is permitted to do a lot of things that are not specifically stated either in the Constitution that authorizes the census in the first place, or in the statute that governs the actual administration of the census. And so for the Supreme Court to say, oh, none of the other things need to be expressly justified, but this needs to be justified, right? It's the APA. The government needs to justify its actions. That's ridiculous in my opinion, and it's clearly biased. It's clear to me that it's a biased decision on the Supreme Court's end. And but anyway, and so regrettably that's the case. But anyway, what I wanted to say here is as follows. I strongly believe that not only is it legal for the Trump administration to do so, but I also know why it is in fact doing so. And the court is right. It's not the VRA. That's not the reason. Voting Rights Act isn't the reason why it's including the question. So I know why the Trump administration is doing it, and I believe it's justified, and I'll explain. So let's back up a few steps here. When the Trump administration says that that it's doing it for the purposes of enforcing the Voting Rights Act, what it means, just for reference purposes, because none of the reporting sources actually explain this. It actually astonishes me how people get away with such lousy reporting. They always say, "Oh, it's a VRA, VRA." Okay, just explain yourself, okay? Um, and none of them bother to do so. They report such extraneous and silly information, but such an essential and important piece of datum they don't include. So let me explain it to you, what I mean by that. So the Voting Rights Act says the Voting Rights Act is meant to support the 15th Amendment. So the 15th Amendment was passed in the 19th century, which says that the states may not discriminate against someone on the basis of race, former enslavement, or color. So a state is not allowed to prevent somebody from voting based on that. That's the 15th Amendment. So in order to support that amendment, Congress is also authorized to make laws supporting that amendment, and obviously the government, the executive branch of the government, is authorized and what's the word to say that? Yes, and obligated, right? And obligated to enforce this. Okay, so the Voting Rights Act is meant to support the 15th Amendment, and as part of the Voting Rights Act, like I said, the federal government is supposed to help in ensuring the states don't discriminate. So when we say that the census is meant to support the VRA, to support enforcement of the VRA, what we mean by that is that if the government knows, so the federal government knows that there are, let's say, out of a population of 1 million, there are 800,000 citizens, according to the census, right? So let's assume that the census is actually correct. There's 800,000. Everyone gave an honest answer, right? So there's 1 million people, but 800,000 of them are citizens. Then now the federal government knows how many people should be voting in the election. And so if for some reason in the upcoming election a significantly lower number of people wind up voting, then presumably there is the state is denying, is suppressing some of the votes, right? Because why would this state have such a low number of people voting, right? The presumption would be that there's a consistent percentage of people vote within each state, and if let's say normally 80% of people vote, then why is there such a discrepancy here in this particular state? So if there is an X number of voters that are allowed to vote legally, they're citizens and allowed to vote. So that's what I mean by helping to support the VRA. Of course, this is a really, really silly basis of including this, because there's almost no way for the federal government to be able to take any action against the state based on this information. Like I implied earlier, people could be giving erroneous information in the first place, but even if they did give accurate information, how will we ever be able to know, let alone prove, that a state is somehow suppressing vote, let alone on the basis of race, color, or former enslaved status? So none of these things are even possible. So obviously it's a silly thing, and I do agree. But I mean, if the government really has to give an honest answer, and that is a precondition to doing anything that it wants to do, then I guess the justices, the Supreme Court would be correct in striking this down. But that's a silly thing to say, because the government doesn't have to give any answers. The government just has to do the right thing, not explain why it's doing the right thing. So, so at the end of the day, I don't think it was struck down correctly. But now I'm going to tell you the real reason why the Trump administration wants to ask this question. And the answer is because there is a very serious flaw in the way the census is conducted right now, and the given its objective, like I explained earlier, of determining apportionment in the House of Representatives. So there's a big flaw in how it is run. and the way, in fact, the representatives are apportioned based on the census. And the flaw is pretty obvious, which is as follows. We're counting the entire population. Okay, according to the Constitution, you got to count the entire population, right? According to the statute, you count the entire population. But the entire population is not able to vote. And so you're creating here a problem here, because if you are, I mean, we would assume, okay, on the face of it, it doesn't make sense to count somebody for the purposes of representative apportionment in Congress if that person cannot vote, right? The whole reason of allocating, let's say, to a particular state, let's say, okay, let's say according to the count of the entire of the state, right? According to the count of people living in that state, this particular state should get 20 representatives, right? And each representative should represent 1 million people. Okay, let's just say hypothetical. Okay. But if those 1 million people include people who cannot vote because they're not citizens, why should that state get 20 representatives? If, let's say, 20% of them are people who cannot vote, then it shouldn't get 20. It should only get 16, right? 4 out of 20 is 20%. Why should it get 20? So right, a representative is supposed to represent people within his district, and they represent the voters, right? That's the whole idea of a representative. That instead of the voter having an active voice in Washington, him or herself, instead the representative represents their vote, their voice, and their will. But if this person does not have the right to voice their will in the first place in the form of a vote, why should they be represented? So someone might say, in response to this, well, slaves were in fact represented even though they couldn't vote. And that in fact was the very famous 2/3 compromise, right? That slaves would count as 2/3 of a vote, but they couldn't vote. Their master cast a vote on their behalf. Okay, so you might argue that that's similar to that, but first of all, that would be extremely insulting to those who cannot vote, and secondly, the legal voters in a state do not, in fact, represent the illegal voters in that state. They cannot, in fact, vote on their behalf the way the way this type of scheme was being carried out in the South but, during slavery. And so this is not, this is neither fish nor fowl. You can't just argue that that's a legitimate basis for doing so if that's not, in fact, being done, right? And so, absent a very organized mechanism of and justified and enduring mechanism of legal voters representing the will of fellow illegal voters in their illegal residence within their state, within their district, absent that, there is no basis for counting them at all, okay, for the purposes of apportioning in Congress. And this should be true across the party lines. I mean, I don't see any basis for a Democratic, if you're being honest, and you're being fair and being conscientious, you shouldn't be arguing for that. The law is the law. I mean, there isn't a partisanship question on holding up the law. Both parties should be wanting to uphold the law. Now, you can change the law all day, all night, but so long as the law is the law, you have to follow the law. And if the person isn't a citizen, nobody's arguing that non-citizens should vote here. I mean, if you are, then let's debate that. But right now, there's a process of becoming a citizen, and so long as you're not a citizen, you're not voting. And if you're not voting, why should you be represented? So, okay, so going back to the reason for including the citizenship question in the census is that if, and I'm going to get back to this conditional in a moment, if everyone gives an honest and correct answer to this question, okay, so all the people who are citizens say, I'm a citizen. All the people who are not citizen say, I'm not a citizen. Now the federal government knows what percentage of people, what percentage of adults in the state are citizens and are not. Now we can actually correct this huge flaw that I just mentioned, which is that as it currently stands, representatives in Congress are apportioned, are allocated based on the total population, not the voting population, but the total population in the state, which includes people who are there illegally, okay, and should not have a voice in government. So if we, what am I saying? Um, I lost my thought. That sentence was too long. Okay, so if we want to correct this flaw, right? That's what I was going to say. If we want to correct this flaw, and the government, the first thing we need to do to further that objective is to know how many people are there legally and how many are not. And once we know that, then Congress can make a law and say, okay, you know what? We're going to actually fix this problem, and we're not going to say, hey, New York, I'm sorry, but we did a count on your residents, and we discovered that only 80% are citizens, and so you're not going to get representatives for. You're not going to get 20 representatives. You're only going to get 16. Okay, because we're only counting 16 million of your residents for the purposes of congressional representation. Okay, so you cannot fix the problem in practice, not in theory, but in practice. You cannot address the problem unless you know how many people are there, how many people are legal voters. Okay, in other words, citizens can vote. How many people are citizens and how many are not? Now, why does Trump not want to tell the truth? Again, we have an obvious reason why, because if he did tell the truth, and that's the reason he wants to do it, then first of all, he can be open to criticism that now, oh, it's against the law, because you don't currently have such a law on the books. So now you're seeking to, this is lawlessness, the left is going to say. Okay, you can't just do something that is not currently the law and ask the question in anticipation of of one day it becoming the law. Okay, which by the way they're wrong on. They're wrong on because again, like I said earlier, the questions in the census are so broad, and the original constitutional objective also, and the statute on this was written in such a way that if if in any way the question might be useful, include it. Okay, so it wasn't written in a way that the government should micromanage what the federal government is doing. It's the opposite. If the federal government has a broad mandate, count the population, figure it out, and in this case, if anything, it's actually even more important than any other type of um, supplemental question other than pure count that is included in the census. Anyway, so yeah, so the reason Trump doesn't want to be candid with the reasoning for including this question is like I said, that's one reason, is because the liberals will go berserk if they find out the real reason. But the other reason is that it might actually uh, cause people to give incorrect answers because um, if they know, okay, because if they know that their state is going to get less representation in Congress, then the Democrats will actually encourage, probably illegally. I'm not sure if there's a law against this, but they will encourage illegal voters to, that is to say, illegal immigrants, who are not allowed to vote. They'll encourage them to answer the question wrongly, to say, yes, I am a citizen. Now, as it currently stands, Trump is not okay. So there are currently protections on the book. Census data cannot be used against individuals. They cannot never be used to identify individuals. In other words, the government is not allowed to look at your specific form and say, "Oh, your name is Joe Schmo, and you answered so and so. Therefore, I'm going to take action against you." It can only be used statistically for aggregates of the population. It cannot be used to take action on individuals. So in fact, anyone who suspects or accuses the Trump administration of trying to deport people or single out people for ill treatment based on giving an honest answer to this is just plain wrong. And in fact, one of the arguments that the left was using against including this question was that, hey, people are going to be afraid of answering, illegal immigrants are going to be afraid to answering any of the questions because they're going to be afraid that of the repercussions of answering this question honestly. That's a very ridiculous, very preposterous argument because, first of all, as I just described, the illegal immigrant shouldn't be answering this anyway, because ideally, he or she should not be included in the count because the count is for the purpose of congressional representation and or allocation of funds, but neither of them should be happening if you are an illegal resident here. The state shouldn't be getting money on your behalf, and the state shouldn't get representation on your behalf in the federal government. So yeah, we actually want you to not answer the survey. But aside from that, it's actually not true. It's not true that the government can take any action against you. And instead of the progressives saying just pouring fuel on this myth, instead they should be saying, okay, no, we're going to let the Trump administration include this question, but let's insist that the Trump administration makes very clear that it will respect the law and it will not target individuals. And therefore, there is no reason for an illegal immigrant to answer this question dishonestly. Okay, so that's what they should have done. And instead, they want to strike down the question. They want to strike the question off altogether. Again, why are they doing it? Because they know the true intent and the true purpose of this question, which is to subsequently, eventually, Congress will make a law reforming the way representation in Congress is determined, so that representatives can only be so the constituency of representatives can only include legal residents who are entitled to vote. So that's the real purpose of this. So I think that I have made my point. Everything that I say is very long-winded, so my apologies, but I think you get the point. So let me see if I've left any stones unturned here. I need to add. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. I remember there's one more thing that I wanted to say, and that is as follows. Okay. So what I wanted to say right now is why indeed was the original mandate of the census based on total population and not on citizens? Why was the Constitution and the statutes based on that? Why do they all say, okay, let's just count the total population and determine based on that how many representatives that district should have in Congress? Why doesn't it say, let's count all the citizens, all the legal voters? And the answer for that is that in common law, let's call it common law, okay? Going back to the foundation of this country, it was commonly understood that if you came to this, back then there were no borders, okay? Remember, there was no border patrol, there was no, there were no border crossings, and if you showed up until well into the 20th century, I'm not sure exactly when it changed, but certainly during the sorry, what did I say? 20th century? Yeah, certainly during the 19th century, during the 1800s, anyone could show up on American soil, and anyone who showed up on American soil would eventually become naturalized. The term naturalized resident appears in the literature of the time of the late 18th and 19th century, and what it meant is, and nobody actually defines that term, but what it actually meant is that you become assimilated, and you become naturalized. It means you behave and act and appear to be a natural, meaning somebody who was born natively. The word natural, native, same root. So natural means somebody who was born in this country. So how do you become naturalized? It's not by going to a government agency and filling out a form, and then the government looking you over and say, okay, let's administer a citizenship questionnaire. A citizenship test. I could do. Let's swear an oath of loyalty to the U.S. None of these things were necessary. There was no legal procedure that a person had to undergo in order to become naturalized. It was in fact a natural act, right? Right, as the name implies. It was um, a naturalized person becomes naturalized naturally by being in this country and adopting the mannerisms and behavioral idiosyncrasies of people living in this country. So, is there a clear line? Is there a clear definition? No, there isn't. But but this is how people lived in those years. Okay, you didn't have people were not litigious back in those years, and it was pretty clear when you were naturalized, and if you were naturalized, then you knew it, and everyone knew it. If you were not, usually people would still know it, right? You don't speak the language, for example. That's a pretty obvious that's a pretty obvious sign that you have not been naturalized. Okay, so that's one thing. Also, if you come to this country as a visitor and you intend to return to your native country, then obviously you're not naturalized. You're not a naturalized citizen. Okay, in fact, you're not a citizen. Almost by definition, you're not a citizen. A citizen means somebody who resides permanently in that place. So you're not a citizen. So, and again, so to be a naturalized citizen, you have to be a permanent resident. You have to intend to stay there permanently, and you have to have assumed the mannerisms of the local native population. And so, why is this important? This definition of a naturalized citizen. The reason it's important is that there was no reason to specify in the Constitution or in the subsequent statutes that we're going to exclude people who are illegal residents, because those people, they're either going back to their home country anyway, in which case, obviously, we're not counting them, right? It was needless to say, we're not going to count them. Okay, it's assumed that they're not going to be counted. You don't count a visitor. No one counts a visitor for any purposes, right? If I want to say, for example, how many people live in this community, I'm not going to count every person who possibly visits, once a year, whatever. They don't live here, right? So everyone understood that a person who intends to return is not going to be counted in the survey. Conversely, if the person did intend to stay, then they were probably naturalized. Okay, there were very few people who were not naturalized. If you stayed back then, there was no interpreters. There was no factions. There were no ethnic groups in the United States. So if you came to this country, you had to quickly learn the language. So there was very little of a transition period, and so it is assumed that if you stay here permanently, you will become naturalized if you are not yet naturalized. And so there was no harm in counting basically anyone who is here permanently, anyone who is a citizen, somebody who resides here permanently. And so that was normal. Again, there was no legal definition back then of citizen. You didn't get a piece of paper to prove that you were a citizen. Nobody had IDs anyway back then. A citizen was somebody who, in fact, not illegal, who was de facto residing permanently in this country. And that was basically it. So that's why it wasn't included. Conversely, nowadays, on the other hand, the situation is very, very different. Nobody credibly and seriously argues that we should have open borders and anyone should be able to enter this country. Everyone is for, even the most liberal, progressive Democrats on the left admit and concede that there should be some form of border control. And so if you are going to control who comes in, and if you're going to say that some people are here illegally and they need to leave, okay, whether it's a criminal or a civil offense, okay, Julian Castro is famously advocated that it should not be a criminal offense in the recent Democratic debates. But even if you take such an extreme position that it should not be criminal, he or she still does not belong in this country, period, right? Even if it's a civil offense, they don't belong here. And if they don't belong here and you want them to leave, we as a government, as a people, want them to leave, why should they be counted? Why should they be counted? Why should a fellow citizen, why should the state, why should congressional representatives from that state be able to benefit off the backs of people who don't belong here? They shouldn't be here. Think about it. And isn't that a perverse incentive to say we're not gonna you know, they shouldn't be here, but your fellow citizen is going to be able to benefit from your presence. you know, I mean, that's kind of like, again, going back to the slavery thing that I brought up earlier. I mean, certainly the South doesn't want to give up slaves if they get to count 2/3 of every slave, right? And suddenly, once emancipation occurs, not only do they lose that 2/3 vote, but now it's going to be a vote against their interests, right? Because the former slaves probably have a whole entire different set of priorities, of political priorities than them. So, so yeah, so here, you get what I'm trying to say here. So, right, so you're giving people, um, so you're creating a very perverse incentive here because on the one hand you're saying that they don't belong here, on the other hand, you are, if you're counting them, then you're saying that we're going to reward people for keeping you here, for ignoring the law and keeping you here. Doesn't make any sense. Okay, anyway, sure you've benefited from this. If you're still watching after half an hour, you're really, really brave because it's boring. Trust me. Hearing myself, it's boring. but, uh, but if you're still here, thank you. Good night.